So in this video I want to show you the top 3 tips how you can actually... Wait, what is this video about? Hey guys, what's good? So I recently read the fun book Remembered by Nelson Dellis, where he describes how he went from a totally normal memory to lots of practice to actually participating in the National USA Memory Championships and actually winning it 6 times. And there they do absolutely normal things like memorizing 100 names, 2 decks of cards, or 200 words in the correct order, all within 15 minutes. So in this video I want to share with you what I learned in this book and how you can actually improve your memory too. So let's get right into it. I absolutely suck at telling you dates and time, but I can 100% tell you all about the rise, the peak and the fall of the Roman Empire. Sounds familiar? Yes? Okay, maybe not. But the thing is this, I thought that I really sucked at memorizing lots of things. And for example, many things I just felt like there was no grip in my mind. I could just not hold on to them, like dates, like time, like theoretical things that were just somehow not that important to me, which subsequently led to me always forgetting names, always forgetting dates, always forgetting things on my calendar and to my to-do list and so on. So I was really assured when the author told us in the book that this is actually completely normal behavior, because our brains simply were not designed to hold on to information that are really theoretical, that are abstract and so on. Because our brains evolved at a time where there was no math, there was no time, so to say, at least there were no clocks and dates and calendars, and there were no complex theoretical structures. What this means is that a true photographic memory, like for example in the show Sherlock, is pretty rare. But still, hope is not lost for all of us, because the author actually started out with a completely normal memory as well. And the key to actually start making information sticking into our brain is to use our brains the right way. And the way how many people try to memorize stuff is like, for example, these children's toys, where you have, for example, a square and they will try to put it with all force into the triangle form. And what this means is that they try to feed their brains with information the wrong way. It's like using the wrong tool at the wrong time. And instead of just forcing yourself to memorize things by just merely repeating it and repeating it all over again, you actually have to use a language your brain understands. And that is the language your brain actually evolved with. And compared to things like, for example, theoretical stuff like remembering names, remembering numbers, your brain does absolutely excel when it comes to things like, for example, stories, scenarios, things you can visualize, that you can tell other people how they actually developed. Because back when our ancestors lived in the savannah, the main form of communication was actually to tell stories about things. For example, 29, 4, 6, 7, 100 million and 2, or yesterday in London I met a really tall man that had spaghetti instead of hair on his head. I think already now it's clear which one of these 2 things you will actually remember, let alone at the end of this video. So what we want to do if we actually want to memorize stuff is to put these things, these abstract information into scenarios, into stories that we can actually way better remember. For example, in the book he explained the scenario where he wanted to actually memorize that his boss told him to make a copy of a document. So what he did, obviously, is that he imagined a scenario in his head where he took the head of his boss and slammed it all over again into the photocopier, which actually worked like a charm, and he did not forget to make that copy, because this is an advice he gives as well. If you create these scenarios, you have to make them really, you want to make sure that you really make those scenarios really interesting, shocking, brutal, whatever, so that you can really make sure that they will stick into your head. Other possibilities are, for example, names. If you meet a new person, then it's oftentimes a real struggle to, especially when you meet quite a lot of people at that time, to remember the name properly. So a good method that the author describes in this book as well is to actually take the name and think about whether you know any celebrity you really know well or that catches your attention, and somehow create a story around that. I recently did this myself, where I met someone called Tom, and I don't know why, but somehow his name and I don't know, just the way he was like an absolutely normal guy. He reminded me of Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars, and I don't know, I created this absolutely weird scenario in my head where I imagined like the scene from Star Wars with Jabba the Hutt and him, and it was absolutely weird. And this is a thing that the author tells you as well, is that you should never ever tell others these stories that help you to actually memorize these information, because they will 100% insult other people, so just keep them for yourself. But it worked like a charm, and hey, it's been 3 weeks and I still remember the name Tom, so this definitely worked. And another example is, for example, I recently had to study for a course course, and there I had to memorize a really abstract construct. It was lots of details, and I really had little time and didn't know how I could actually memorize this. So what I did is that I typed everything that I wanted to memorize into ChatGPT and just added the prompt, please make a somewhat interesting story out of that. And what ChatGPT did is that it created this really weird fantasy story about this absolutely boring subject I had to study. But what ChatGPT did is that it created this odd scenario about wizards that met at a river, and they had to go into 2 different villages that represented these things I had to study, which really just worked like a charm, and that's just definitely a really good thing that you can actually just try out. So in German, there's this term called, literally translated, donkey bridge. Eselsbrücke. And you might wonder, why the hell do I tell you this? Well, the reason for that is that sometimes our brains just need a little bit more help to actually get over the problem. And this term, donkey bridge, stems from the idea that back then when people actually transported the majority of their stuff with donkeys, that sometimes they would come to a stream, to like a little just tiny river, a stream, where you could just easily step through. But because donkeys are usually afraid of water, they will not move an inch. So what people back then did is that they just built this tiny bridge of stones, which immediately worked, and the donkey would just step over the river. All of this means is that there are sometimes scenarios that are like a bit too abstract, a bit too weird, or a bit too detailed to actually form into a proper storyline, which is why there are certain techniques that people who participate, for example, in the USA National Memory Championships oftentimes used. So here I want to go about my favorite few ones that can actually help you as well to tackle certain problems. So the first one is what is actually literally called in German a donkey bridge, and in English this is sometimes referred to as a mnemonic bridge. And these are little phrases like this one. My very excited mother just served us noodles. Never eat soggy waffles. How I wish I could calculate pi. King Philip came over for some good soup. These mnemonic bridges, these donkey bridges, are like really handy because you can really put really random stuff into one phrase and easily remember it. And if this doesn't work well for you, then you can make use of another method that is actually used in the show Sherlock, which is the memory palace, or how it's actually called, the Loki method. Not sure why it's called Loki. I think probably from Latin, like locus, Loki, plural. But the gist of this method is that you visualize, for example, a room or a house, and you will actually attach information you want to actually memorize to certain objects in this room that is in your mind, or in this house. And this works really well to remember, on the one hand, lots of details about a certain thing, but also, for example, whole mind maps, whole organized clusters of information. A really practical example for this would actually, for example, be is that you would imagine a room in your head that is maybe called your recipe room. And in this room, there's a table. And in the real world, you actually want to memorize the recipe of, for example, let's say waffles again. So you close your eyes and remember this table with eggs, with vanilla sugar, with flour, etc., etc. And this makes use of how our brains actually work, is that they imagine scenarios, that they imagine and remember stories and things in the real world. So instead of now creating a story, you basically create memories, like why it's called the memory palace, that you can actually go back to and remember then again. And then you see this mental image and can translate it, so to speak, into the real world, into the real information again. Another favorite method of mine is called chunking. And this is not like a really spectacular method. I don't know if it even can be properly called a method, but this helps a lot to facilitate remembering numbers, for example. Let's say, for example, you want to memorize a phone number like 987654321. Okay, maybe this is a bad example, but you get the gist. If this was a random number, then it would be quite hard to memorize it in the first place, but it would facilitate it a lot if you would just split that phone number up into 987, 654, and 3210. And in this way, instead of memorizing like 10 digits, you basically just have to memorize 3 bit longer numbers. And if this is still too easy for you and you want to memorize something more complex, then you can make use of, for example, the name method or the major method when it comes to memorizing numbers. The name method is actually quite simple. You just take the numbers 0 to 9 and link them to a letter, for example. 0 is O, 1 is A, 2 is B, etc., etc. And then you will basically build a story again in your mind with people who have the same letters in the beginning of the name and surname. And for example, 55 would be Donald Duck, and remembering Donald Duck is way easier, and then you can build on that and make a more complex story out of that with maybe other characters So memorizing a longer story is really easy. And the other method is, for example, again, the major system, where you take a look at the numbers 0 to 9 again, and you will link them now to a consonant. I will show this here, how other people do this, which letters they normally use. And what you will then do is then, if you have a longer number, you can actually translate this number into a word. And this word is, when it's something in the real world, for example, way easier to actually memorize. So the next point on our list is 736593. You see what I mean? And it is to just practice to remember things more often in your everyday life. A very good example in my case, for example, is that I struggled a bit with remembering TANs, remembering PIN codes, etc., because I often will get them on my phone as an SMS, for example, when I do mobile banking or when I sign up into a new website, for example, and they will ask for my phone number and will send me a PIN code that I then have to enter for the two-factor authentication. And I just made a game out of it to, as quickly as possible, remember these digits when I see them and immediately enter them. And this really worked well. As soon as I started to do this more often, I now found myself in a position where it's so easy to remember, like, for example, 6, 7, 8 numbers by just looking at them once. And I can assure you that previously I was absolutely not able to do this. So this is really fun that you can actually see those results in real life. Another example of something I really sucked at was to do math in my head, because I used to do this all the time when I was back in school, but now this has been a couple of years ago. But recently I had to take a course in economics again, and I had to learn it all over again. I was so used to using a calculator all the time that the skill really faded. But for the sake of speed, I just decided to do this more often in my head. The first few times it was a bit hard and it took me quite a while. I felt quite stupid again, but after just a few days it just worked like a charm again, and now I'm in a position where I can really just easily, quickly do quick maths.
2 + 2 is 4, -1, that's 3, quick maths.
In my head again, which is quite nice. And all of this goes to say that we actually have to use our brains if we want to get better at memorizing things. Because our brains and the way how we store information in our brain is really similar to how our muscles, for example, work. Just as the motto goes, use it or lose it, you want to actually use your brain more often to become better at memorizing things. Because when you do the opposite of that, then you will actually slowly lose this ability and have to retrain it and relearn it basically again. Because every skill you have actually just exists because in your brain there are neurons that fire together, the neural connections that exist and are strengthened each and every time you use them. And these neural connections will actually fade away once you stop using them. And a good example for that is actually me talking right now in English to you, because English is not my mother tongue. Because the more I do this, the more we'll actually get better at that. And a good example for the exact opposite of that is, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who emigrated from Austria, thus his native language is German as well, who moved to the United States and has ever since lived there. And because since he moved to the United States, he basically 95% of the time actually only talks in English. He did not per se lose his ability to speak his mother tongue German.
Tägliche Laufen, was du magst, Schwimmen, Boxen, Kickboxing.
Although this is actually his mother tongue. He has like this really thick American accent when speaking German. And for a lot of people, it's not only that they have a hard time remembering things per se, but it's also that they are oftentimes distracted and really have a hard time to actually focus on things. If this sounds like you, then make sure to click here on this video specifically made for that, where I explain how you can actually increase your attention span and focus for longer, so that you can actually learn the stuff you actually want to learn. So make sure to click here, and besides that, thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video. Bye bye.